Okay, let's unpack this. For the last 10 years, I mean, if you were following global science funding even slightly, you couldn't miss the Human Brain Project, the HBP.
Hmm.
And this wasn't just, another research grant. This thing was huge. A proper scientific moonshot, really. One of the most ambitious civilian science projects we've seen in a long time.
Oh, absolutely. You're talking about a massive commitment. It was a 1 billion 10-year initiative launched by the European Union, ran from October 2013 right through to September 2023.
10 full years.
10 years. Coordinated by EPFL, that's the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne in Geneva. And the core idea, the really breathtaking mission, was using modern supercomputing to try and, well, fundamentally change how we understand the brain.
€1 billion. And it wasn't just for salaries and lab equipment, was it? The focus was on building infrastructure.
Exactly. That was the key deliverable in many ways.
And we need to be clear for you listening, when we say infrastructure for this, we're talking about some serious computing power. This wasn't like, oh, let's build a slightly faster computer.
No, no, not at all.
They were aiming for exascale computing from the get-go, which means building machines that can crunch, over a quintillion calculations per second? A billion. Just mind-boggling numbers.
That scale really tells you something about the sheer scale of the challenge they set themselves. So our deep dive today is really about dissecting that decade. We want to understand their core strategy.
Right.
Look closely at the 6, frankly, incredible technology platforms they managed to build. Touch on why they ran into some pretty major internal controversy, and figure out what legacy is actually left now that the HBP has officially wrapped up.
Okay, so the problem is modeling the human brain. People say it's the most complex object in the known universe.
Right.
Where do you even begin with something like that? What was the HBP's blueprint?
Well, they knew they couldn't just simulate the whole thing at once, that was clear. But they also knew you couldn't just ignore parts of it either. So the core strategy was essentially to investigate the brain across vastly different scales all at the same time.
Different scales,
Yeah.
meaning like,
Meaning everything from the tiny molecular level individual proteins, synapses, right up to the huge networks of neurons that underpin, higher cognitive functions, thinking, deciding, learning. And across time, too, from milliseconds up to years of development or aging.
okay, but how do you stop that just becoming 100 different research projects going in 100 different directions? That sounds like chaos.
Right, that's where the integration piece comes in.
Huh.
And the structure. They set up this constant collaborative loop. It was designed to work like this. You take experimental data, real measurements from labs, use that data to develop theoretical models of how things might work. Then you run those models as simulations on the supercomputers.
Okay.
Those simulations generate predictions. If our model is right, then X should happen. And then crucially, you go back to the lab and test those predictions empirically with new experiments.
So it's a feedback loop. Data, model, simulate, predict, test, get new data.
Exactly. A closed feedback loop designed to constantly refine the digital models, making them more accurate representations of the actual biology.
And the goal wasn't just the insights from that loop, was it? It was about making the loop itself, the machinery, available to everyone.
Precisely. That's a really key point. The central objective was to create a permanent ICT-based research infrastructure, something accessible to researchers all over the world. You can almost think of the HBP's job as building the shared library, the massive processing power, and maybe even the standardized language that neuroscience really needed to move forward collectively.
To give you a sense of just how big this construction project was, the HBP was split into 12 sub-projects. Now, 4 of those were focused on the actual science-gathering data, understanding mouse brain organization, human brain organization, cognitive neuroscience theory.
Right, the foundational knowledge gathering.
But 6 of them, the majority in a way, were dedicated entirely to building those crucial ICT platforms. That's the high-tech hardware, the software, the databases. That's where, a huge chunk of that $1 billion investment actually went.
And that's really where the technological payoff emerged, I think. It's what has outlived the project itself. These 6 ICT platforms, they are the tangible legacy we can point to.
Okay, let's dive into those platforms, because this is where it gets really interesting technologically. You can't simulate something if you can't organize the input data, right?
Right.
So what was the first piece they needed?
That would absolutely be the neuroinformatics platform. Its job sounds simple, but it was massive. Gather, organize, standardize, and then make available these vast, often disconnected troves of brain data from labs everywhere.
So like a giant standardized digital library for brain data.
Exactly. It's the foundational catalog, the bedrock for everything else.
Okay, catalog sorted. Then you need to actually build the digital models from that data.
And that's platform number 2, the brain simulation platform. This is where they develop the specific software, the methods, the tools for creating these data-driven digital reconstructions of brain tissue.
Hmm.
And of course, the simulation capabilities to run them to see how these digital brain slices function.
But even simulating a tiny slice of brain tissue, that must take enormous computing power, mustn't it? Let alone trying to scale it up. What was driving all this?
Yeah, you're hitting on a key challenge. That's where the high-performance analytics and computing platform, the HP Libre platform, came in. This was the engine room. It provided that exascale supercomputing backbone needed for mapping the brain structure, building really complex models, and then analyzing the mountains of data those simulations produce.
The muscle?
It's the muscle, the raw power needed to run the simulation and crunch the numbers.
Okay, so those three platforms sound like the core research and computation loop, but the HPP always had these big medical ambitions too. How did they connect the simulations to, say, understanding diseases in actual patients?
That was the role of the Medical Informatics Platform, or MIP. This platform was crucial. It built the secure, federated infrastructure needed to share anonymized hospital data and medical research data across different institutions, different countries, without compromising privacy.
Federated, meaning the data stays where it is, but researchers can query across it.
Exactly. It allows researchers to look for patterns, understand how diseases cluster, how they progress over time, maybe identify unique biological signatures of diseases like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's within the brain data, all while respecting data privacy rules.
That seems incredibly important for speeding up things like drug discovery or finding better diagnostic tools. Okay, so that's 4. The last 2 platforms really seem to point towards future hardware, don't they?
They do. And one of them, in particular, represents maybe the biggest technological spillover beyond just biology.
Which one's that?
That has to be the neuromorphic computing platform. You could argue this has potentially the biggest direct commercial application down the line. This platform was focused on developing completely new types of computer chips, energy-efficient hardware inspired by the brain's structure and function, not relying on the traditional silicon architectures we use now.
So, trying to build chips that compute more like a network of neurons does. Parallel, maybe more efficient.
Precisely. Mimicking the brain's incredible energy efficiency is a huge goal for computing generally. And this platform pushed that forward. And then finally, you needed a way to check if these complex brain simulations actually behave like, well, a functioning system in an environment.
Right. Does the simulation actually do anything realistic?
Exactly. And that's where the neurorobotics platform came in. It developed virtual robots and even some real physical robots along with virtual environments. These are used as test beds for the brain simulations. Plug the simulated brain into a simulated body and see if it can navigate a room or learn a task. It grounds the simulation in action.
It's just an incredibly ambitious tech roadmap, 6 major interconnected platforms. But like you said, committing €1 billion, funded roughly half by the European Commission, half by national and private sources, that solves the money problem, perhaps.
Yeah, the funding was secured eventually.
But it doesn't magically solve the scientific problem, does it? And they hit some pretty serious roadblocks fairly early on.
They absolutely did. And one of the primary hurdles was, well, it was technical in a way, but it really stemmed from how neuroscience had been done for decades. It was the incredibly unsystematic nature of the existing data.
Ah, okay. So you're building this amazing high-tech infrastructure, this super highway, but the raw material you have to feed into it, the actual data, is like it's arriving on donkey carts from all different directions using different maps.
That's a pretty good analogy, actually. The existing data was all over the place. It varied hugely depending on the species being studied: mouse, rat, monkey, human. It varied based on the biological classification schemes researchers were using. It varied based on the developmental stage of the brain being looked at.
So trying to stitch that together into one coherent model.
It was like trying to assemble a coherent encyclopedia from thousands of pages ripped out of different books, written in different scientific dialects, often contradicting each other. That lack of systematic cohesion made the original grand goal, replicating the brain as a single integrated system model, just incredibly difficult from the outset.
And even if they could magically standardize all that data overnight, there were still fundamental engineering constraints, weren't there?
Oh, yes. Big ones. They were operating right at the absolute edge of what computation could do then and arguably even now. Our source material points out that simply representing individual neurons in the kind of biological detail needed for accurate simulation is, and I quote, very computationally expensive.
Just one neuron.
Just representing one neuron
Hmm.
accurately takes a lot of computing power. Scale that up to billions. We're talking fundamental limits related to power consumption. These supercomputers use immense amounts of electricity, memory capacity, data storage. These were huge engineering problems. Whole brain simulation, even a simplified version, still sits right at the bleeding edge of what's technologically feasible.
So you have this immense ambition, these deep technical challenges with data and computation. It feels almost inevitable that this would lead to some friction, some controversy. And it did, didn't it? Around 2014, 2015, things got quite heated publicly.
Yes, they really did. The academic community, or at least a significant part of it, kind of erupted.
Mm.
There was a very public open letter signed by hundreds of European neuroscientists basically complaining that the HBP had adopted an overly narrow approach.
Overly narrow. Meaning what exactly? This sounds like the high-level cognitive scientists, the people studying thought, behavior, consciousness, saying, hang on a minute, you're spending all this money building the pipes and the power stations, but you're not funding the research into what the brain actually does at a complex level.
That's pretty much the core of the criticism.
Hmm.
They felt the funding was overwhelmingly focused on the bottom-up approach, the molecular detail, the biological modeling, building the infrastructure platforms, and that this was sidelining the top-down study of higher brain functions, cognition, behavior. Some very influential voices argue that the whole foundational goal, the large-scale simulation of the entire brain, was simply radically premature.
Radically premature. Strong words.
Very strong. They were essentially saying, we don't know enough yet to even attempt this kind of simulation meaningfully.
It sounds almost ironic. The very researchers whose insights you'd ultimately need to feed into a complete brain model were the ones criticizing the project for focusing too much on building the machine to run the model. How did the HBP leadership respond to that criticism?
Well, the HBP leadership didn't just dismiss it out of hand.
Mm-hmm.
Their counterargument was essentially the platforms have to come first. They argued that while neuroscience was generating absolutely vast amounts of data, the basic technology for sharing that data, for organizing it, for integrating it across different labs and scales, it just didn't exist in a usable form.
Oh.
The HBP saw itself as providing that critical missing layer, that foundational infrastructure. They insisted that cognitive and behavioral neuroscience would become a major component of the project, but only after the basic platforms were built and stable. You need the tools before you can properly use them for complex questions, was the argument.
But the criticism clearly landed, it had an impact, right? It led to actual structural changes within the HBP.
It absolutely did. There was a major review, and following the public pressure and the review's recommendations, the original quite small 3-member executive committee that had initially led the project was dissolved in 2015. It was replaced by a much larger, broader 22-member governing board.
22 members. That's a big shift.
It was a significant change, yeah. It demonstrated, I think, a clear move towards more distributed governance, trying to be more responsive to the concerns of the wider European neuroscience community. A definite course correction.
Okay, so the project navigated the controversy, adapted its structure, built the platforms, and ran its course, finishing up last year, 2023. The original grand vision, a full simulation of the human brain.
Well, that's still some way off, it seems fair to say.
Yes, that specific goal wasn't achieved in the 10 years.
So after all that effort, all that money, all that technology, what does this massive project actually mean for us now? For you listening, what are the real implications, the concrete legacy? Well, I think the implications are actually huge. And it's largely because the HBP, maybe partly due to the controversy, successfully pivoted its focus. It shifted from chasing that single, perhaps impossible at the time, simulation, towards delivering a collection of robust, genuinely usable tools and infrastructures.
Let's break that down. What about the medical side first? You mentioned the medical informatics platform, the MIP. How does that translate into actual benefits for patients or doctors?
By creating that secure way to share anonymized clinical data across hospitals and research centers, the MIP allows researchers to spot patterns related to diseases much faster and across much larger populations. This can accelerate the investigation of complex disease signatures. What does Alzheimer's actually look like in brain data across thousands of people?
Right.
It can help predict patient outcomes better. And, maybe most importantly, it opens up avenues for developing lower cost, more advanced diagnostic methods, or even testing potential treatments virtually using the simulation platforms. especially for really complex neurological or psychiatric disorders where progress has been slow.
And the computational legacy sounds massive too. We talked about neuromorphic computing earlier. That kind of brain-inspired hardware, surely that has applications way beyond just neuroscience.
Oh, absolutely. The sheer need for more energy-efficient ways to handle massive computations, which the HPP helped drive forward, is impacting industries way outside biology. This kind of technology is relevant for data mining, making machine learning algorithms run more efficiently, improving telecommunications. The list goes on.
So real technological spillover.
Definitely. The specialized hardware concepts, the software developed to run these incredibly complex simulations, some of that is becoming commercially valuable in its own right. And we shouldn't forget the ethical dimension either. The HPP had a dedicated ethics advisory board and an ethics and society program. They were constantly looking at the societal implications, the ethical challenges, the long-term consequences of developing these incredibly powerful brain research and simulation tools, ensuring the research stayed responsible.
So when you boil it all down, the real lasting artifact isn't the fully simulated brain in a computer,
Not yet, anyway.
but it's the set of tools, the infrastructure that was built in pursuit of that vision.
Exactly. And that brings us neatly to the ultimate successor, the concrete legacy, eBrains, the European Brain Research Infrastructures.
eBrains.
Yes, this is now an international nonprofit association set up directly as a result of the HBP's work. eBrains is the ongoing entity. It gathers, maintains, and provides access to all those things we talked about, the brain atlases, the simulation tools like the Spinnaker software suite, the curated data, the computing platforms from the global scientific community. The HBP essentially built a permanent, shared, high-tech foundation for future neuroscience.
So recapping then, we've seen the sheer scale of the initial ambition, the incredible technological platforms that were actually built, those 6 core ICT pillars, and also the significant internal struggle, the controversy, that ultimately helped shape its final direction.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating when you look back, I think, is the irony. That highly criticized, radically premature initial goal of creating a comprehensive bottom-up brain simulation.
Right.
It wasn't fully realized in the HBP's lifetime.
Right.
Yet, you could argue that the failure to achieve that incredibly ambitious original vision directly led to the success of building something perhaps more immediately valuable. This lasting, necessary, shared, high-tech research infrastructure. The practical value ended up being in the functional technological foundation eBrains, which is now operational and serving researchers today.
And that foundation is still evolving, still growing. Even though the Human Brain Project officially ended in 2023, eBrains, the infrastructure it created, is now formally a member of the European Open Science Cloud Association. That really cements its role in the future of collaborative European research. Which leaves us, and you listening, with a really interesting question, doesn't it? How will future large-scale international science projects, especially ones tackling incredibly complex data-intensive challenges like understanding the mind, how will they best balance that initial, maybe controversial, grand vision that inspires people and attracts funding with the perhaps more practical, sustained need for building shared, open-source, foundational research platforms like eBrains? It's a tricky balance. We really encourage you to check out the eBrains website, explore the resources available there, and see this operational legacy for yourself.